Like I said, Marla's not here tonight. My apologies. I'm going to do my best. She gave me her notes, and I've heard her do this thing probably half a dozen times, so I'll do my best on her bit. But we'll see what happens. Ready to go? Well, welcome everybody to Class 2 of How Do We Navigate Our Post-Truth World, a crash course in critical thinking. Glad everybody could come. It's a wonderful day out. I was a bit tempted to, play hooky, but glad to see everybody else is here. And you should have the syllabus or the outline of today's course that has the key points that we'll be going through and outline, and then 4 books that we recommend. There's a whole bunch of books that we recommend, and they're all to be found, I think, over here. The library has them all, and want to put a plug in for the library. It's $30 a year to be a member of the library and to have checkout privileges and all that sort of thing, and I believe that's good for 2 people. So if you're a couple of some kind, that can be good for both of you. So it's a great opportunity, and again, pretty much all the books that we reference, plus a lot of other things that we won't reference in this class, are available there. And want everybody, just to remind you, set your controls for discovery. This is a really great group. Sometimes we get groups that you get a little nervous when we get into topics, but should be a pretty safe topic tonight. But we want to encourage you to, as Marla says, be an anthropologist from Mars. Kind of go in discovery mode. We're going to be dealing with, particularly in my section, we're going to be dealing with a little bit of more science, which I think is really interesting, but it'll certainly challenge all of us to think, better. And as always, please, if you can, hold your questions till the end of each section. We'll have plenty of time. And then at the end tonight, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. If there's something that you want to talk about, some things that you want to add to the mix, things that we left out, think should be in. It's really important that everyone, has an opportunity to talk, because we're obviously not going to cover everything that needs to be brought into the discussion. So again, critical thinking. This is what we're doing in this course. What do we mean by that? Well, objective analysis and evaluation designed to form good judgment. That involves conscious, deliberate questioning, adopting a skeptical mindset, questioning not only the assumptions of others, but also our own. And as I've said, at the root of this is the idea of discernment, with a view to having good judgment. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to know everything, but you're going to be able to, hopefully all of us, the better we become at critical thinking, the better we'll be able to make good judgments about the things that we come across. Doesn't mean we'll be right, but hopefully we'll have some good judgment about it. And there's a word there on the screen, it's in red, that usually sticks out. It's this idea of objective analysis and evaluation, because getting objective is really, really difficult, particularly nowadays. In our first class and in the introduction, we asked the question, how do we know what's true? This is very, very difficult today, because, those of us who are my age, we grew up at a time when there was a lot more commonality in how we understood the world. Some of that wasn't so great, because there were a lot of voices back in those days that you couldn't hear. And so now we have more of those voices, which is a really good thing. But there are so many voices now, particularly with the internet, that it becomes really hard to know, what do I believe? What's true? How do I sort through and have good judgment? And we talked about this idea that we live in a post-truth world. And this was the Oxford Dictionary's 2016 word of the year, I believe. What do we mean by post-truth? Well, it's a time when objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. It's kind of where we are today, particularly if you look at our politics, which we will not get into tonight. There's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of outrage all over the place. Probably not a lot of objective fact gathering, because when we get emotional about things, it's really hard to assess facts. And the key to all of that, of course, is to become critical thinkers. And last week, I pulled out a quote from Steve Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, which I really recommend that you read. The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, something we'll look at in our last class. Steven Pinker says something important to remember, particularly in light of this idea that it's so hard for us today to know what is true. He says we are a cognitive species that depends on explanations of the world. Humans are a cognitive thinking kind of species. We want to know, we want to have some kind of knowledge about the world so that we can survive in the world and be successful. He writes, since the world is the way it is, regardless of what people believe about it, there is a strong selection pressure for an ability to develop explanations that are true. And look around you here at this library. All of these books, these are all people with a thirst to know what's true. We really want to have some real knowledge. And as Pinker says, that's a driving impulse that humans have. So, and again, it's all kind of rooted in critical thinking. So last week, our first time around, we had two sections. I talked about feeling machines that think, how minds make behavior. And we asked three questions and examined them. The first was, what is mind? What do we mean by mind? The second one was, why do we have minds? And then the third one was, how do thoughts come to mind? What are the different ways that thoughts come into our minds? And if you remember, we looked at slow thinking and fast thinking. And we'll return to that a little bit next week. We'll come back to that. If you weren't here last week, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then Marla did a section called Know Thyself. What gets in the way of thinking? We looked at triggers, we looked at defenses, and we looked at reactivity. And the point of this first class really was to get people being mindful about their thinking, to kind of think about the thinking, before you actually kind of do the thinking. How do we clear that up? And we're going to continue that just a little bit today by asking the question, why do we struggle with being wrong? Not knowing or feeling uncertain. That's kind of what we're going to look at today. And we've got two sections. Marla's going to do, I'm going to do for Marla, a section called Being Right, Not Knowing and Feeling Uncertain. We're going to explore the need we seem to have to be right all the time. And then I'm going to come, we'll take a break in between of that, and then I'll stop channeling Marla, and I'll come, and I'm going to do a short bit called My Side Bias, which I think is one of the most important things to understand, particularly if you want to get a handle on what's happening with politics today and our division. Why is it that we all seem to have this my side bias? We're going to talk about what's called motivated reasoning. And motivated reasoning is a really great idea. If you learn about motivated reasoning, you can impress people at parties and talking to them about something that's really kind of on the cutting edge of science. So being right, not knowing, and feeling certain. And I'm going to take Marla's notes and do my best to kind of go through her bit. First of all, who thinks that they're always right? Sometimes, right? Who thinks they're always right? Who here has never changed their mind about anything? We've actually had people in talks when Marla asked this questions who have raised their hands, believe it or not. You don't know if they're joking about it, but most of us know that we're not right all the time. To change your mind, you need to recognize that you were wrong about something prior, right? Then why is it so hard to admit we're wrong? Why do you think it is so hard to admit we're wrong? Anybody? Can you think of why? Pride, okay. Why else? Why is it hard to admit we're wrong? Since we are wrong so much of the time. Ego. Yeah? Any other ideas?
I think a lot of it's around ego,
Yeah?
and it's around a world in which I'm insecure about myself and my place in it.
Yep.
And so by being right, I guarantee my place in it, and I measure myself against the people around me. If they're wrong and I'm right, then I have value.
Yeah.
And if my value is eroded by being wrong, because that's how I see my value, then that's very dangerous to me. Falls into the narcissist
Yeah.
personality.
Very well said. Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of reasons. Being wrong or not knowing can bring up feelings of shame. You know, remember the dunce, as I was growing up, we had the image, not so much today because it's very politically incorrect. But back in those days, you had the idea of if you got an answer wrong, you went into the corner, put the dunce head on. The shame, that brings on. Shame and humiliation are very powerful emotions. And we're geared up to avoid those kinds of things. We don't like being wrong. Sometimes one's very sense of self feels threatened by uncertainty. And this is a quote from Catherine Schultz. Her book, Being Wrong, is really a terrific book. Has anybody read her book, Being Wrong? It's really a terrific book. And we're going to listen to her a little bit later. But she says, being wrong, even about the smallest things, can shake up our sense of self and security, of the idea that we understand ourselves and the world. You're right. It really shakes up our security. It can be really unnerving. So it's hard, particularly with people we don't know, people that we're uncomfortable with, people that we're dialoguing with. It becomes really difficult to admit that we're wrong. And chances are we are going to be wrong about stuff today, particularly because of, among other things, the media that we get is getting a lot of stories wrong these days that seem like all over the place. So being wrong, is something we're going to run into all the time. How exactly do we live? How do we live with that? And as Marla says in her notes, part of learning how to think, to be a critical thinker, is learning that it's okay to be wrong. It's a great quote. Some of you may know Malcolm Gladwell, his book Blink, a great example of somebody who's a critical thinker. He says, I feel I change my mind all the time. And I sort of feel that's your responsibility as a person, as a human being, to constantly be updating your positions on as many things as possible. And if you don't contradict yourself on a regular basis, then you're not thinking. If you're always right, that's a pretty good indication that you're not really critical thinking. And just biographically, I started doing these talks 3 years ago before Marla even joined me. And I go back and I look at the notes from our early talks and I'm like, oh gosh, I was wrong about that. I've had to change my mind. Some of it comes from presenting material and getting feedback from people in the groups like, I missed that. I didn't see that. So being wrong is really something that that we ought to feel comfortable with. And it really begins with this idea of intellectual humility. In our talks on bridging the divide, it's one of the things that we focus on a lot with people on either side of the political divide and everybody that's in between, which is most people. The need to have some kind of intellectual humility. The fact that we don't know everything. Some of these issues, most of these issues that we have to grapple with today are so complicated. Even our legislators, who are supposed to be very knowing, can't possibly really plumb the depths of them. So it's okay to be wrong. And Marla has a great definition for intellectual humility. She says, knowing my strengths and limitations with no self-judgments about them. Nothing to defend, nothing to hide. There's nothing to prove. Having this kind of state of intellectual humility. And if we're going to be critical thinkers, and we're going to move on to learn about how to reason, how to examine evidence, we really have to begin with this sense of intellectual humility. Feeling right, you could say, has some benefits. Feeling right makes us feel really good about ourselves. If we're right, we can feel strong, we can feel powerful, feeling certain, confident, righteous, secure, safe. Those things, they can make us really feel good, but in the long run, they can do a lot of damage. And one of the things that Marla talks about, she says, for me to think about another point of view or new information that is counter to what I already think, I have to be able to allow for the possibility that I might be wrong. If you're sitting down with somebody who you'd have a disagreement with, maybe it's politics, maybe it's spirituality or something like that, or just a practical issue, being able to take in new information really requires a commitment, to the possibility that I might be wrong. She says, if I'm not okay with the possibility of being wrong, I won't be able to risk taking in someone else's perspectives, which is part of being able to think critically. Certainty is a real problem. Certainty is the conviction that I cannot possibly be wrong. And I think this is another quote from Catherine Schultz. Only the closed mind is certain. If you want to be open-minded, if you want to be a critical thinker, an exploratory thinker, you have to kind of put certainty on a leash, maybe a long leash, to be able to entertain and take in new perspectives. And of course, one of the downsides, again, Marla talks about this a lot, being wrong, even about the smallest things, can shake up our sense of self and security of the idea that we understand ourselves and the world. It's this idea of kind of feeling wobbly, and it's something that Marla talks about, quite a bit. When she and I first started working, she just had a real revolution in her thinking about things, and she uses this word wobbly to talk about how, when you're inundated with new information, it can make you kind of feel a little uncertain. We just sat down. We're going to be doing the Immense Possibilities show on SOP TV. We just sat down with the producer, and she sat down with us as a kind of a warm-up to getting together, and we were talking to her about the political divide and all these issues, and you could just see, she finally said, whoa, she was feeling wobbly. It was all this information that she was not aware of. This is all kind of new to her. And it was a really great experience for all of us together, but you could kind of see it, that she was kind of feeling, a little bit unsettled. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at a brief TED Talk from Catherine Schultz. This is one of our favorite TED Talks. And it's about 18 minutes, and then we'll finish up. We'll do a little bit of exercises, and then we'll take a break. I hope you enjoy it.
So it's 1995. I'm in college, and a friend and I go on a road trip from Providence, Rhode Island to Portland, Oregon. We're young and unemployed, so we do the whole thing on back roads, through state parks and national forests, basically the longest route we can possibly take. And somewhere in the middle of South Dakota, I turn to my friend, and I ask her a question that's been bothering me for 2,000 miles. What's up with the Chinese character I keep seeing by the side of the road? My friend looks at me totally blankly. There's actually a gentleman in the front row who's doing a perfect imitation of her look. And I'm like, all the signs we keep seeing with the Chinese character on them. She just stares at me for a few moments. And then she cracks up, because she figures out what I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about is this. Right, the famous Chinese character for picnic area. I have spent the last 5 years of my life thinking about situations exactly like this. Why we sometimes misunderstand the signs around us, and how we behave when that happens, and what all of this can tell us about human nature. In other words, as you heard Chris say, I've spent the last 5 years thinking about being wrong. This might strike you as a strange career move, but it actually has one great advantage: no job competition. In fact, most of us do everything we can to avoid thinking about being wrong, or at least to avoid thinking about the possibility that we ourselves are wrong. You know, we get it in the abstract. We all know everybody in this room makes mistakes. The human species in general is fallible. Okay, fine. But when it comes down to me right now, to all the beliefs I hold here in the present tense, suddenly all of this abstract appreciation of fallibility goes out the window. And I can't actually think of anything I'm wrong about. And the thing is, you know, the present tense is where we live. We go to meetings in the present tense. We go on family vacations in the present tense. We go to the polls and vote in the present tense. So effectively, we all wind up kind of traveling through life sort of trapped in this little bubble of feeling very right about everything. I think this is a problem. I think it's a problem for each of us as individuals in our personal and professional lives. And I think it's a problem for all of us collectively as a culture. So what I want to do today is, first of all, talk about why we get stuck inside this feeling of being right. And second, why it's such a problem. And finally, I want to convince you that it is possible to step outside of that feeling. And that if you can do so, it is the single greatest moral, intellectual, and creative leap you can make. So, why do we get stuck in this feeling of being right? One reason actually has to do with the feeling of being wrong. So let me ask you guys something. Or actually, let me ask you guys something, because you're right here. How does it feel, emotionally? How does it feel to be wrong? Dreadful. Thumbs down. Embarrassing. Okay, wonderful, great. Dreadful, thumbs down, embarrassing. Thank you. These are great answers. But they're answers to a different question. You guys are answering the question, how does it feel to realize you're wrong? Realizing you're wrong can feel like all of that, and a lot of other things, right? I mean, it can be devastating, it can be revelatory, it can actually be quite funny, like my stupid Chinese character mistake. But just being wrong doesn't feel like anything. I'll give you an analogy. You remember that Looney Tunes cartoon where there's this kind of pathetic coyote who's always chasing and never catching a roadrunner? In pretty much every episode of this cartoon, there's a moment where the coyote is chasing the roadrunner, and the roadrunner runs off a cliff, which is fine. He's a bird. He can fly. But the thing is, the coyote runs off the cliff right after him. And what's funny, at least if you're 6 years old, is that the coyote's totally fine too. He just keeps running. Right up until the moment that he looks down and realizes that he's in midair. That's when he falls. When we're wrong about something, not when we realize it, but before that, we're like that coyote after he's gone off the cliff and before he looks down. You know, we're already wrong. We're already in trouble. But we feel like we're on solid ground. So I should actually correct something I said a moment ago. It does feel like something to be wrong. It feels like being right. So this is one reason, a structural reason, why we get stuck inside this feeling of rightness. I call this error blindness. You know, most of the time, we don't have any kind of internal cue to let us know that we're wrong about something until it's too late. But there's a second reason that we get stuck inside this feeling as well, and this one is cultural. Think back for a moment to elementary school. You're sitting there in class, and your teacher is handing back quiz papers. And one of them looks like this. This is not mine, by the way. So there you are in grade school, and you know exactly what to think about the kid who got this paper. That's the dumb kid, the troublemaker, the one who never does his homework. So by the time you are 9 years old, you've already learned, first of all, that people who get stuff wrong are lazy, irresponsible dimwits. And second of all, that the way to succeed in life is to never make any mistakes. We learn these really bad lessons really well. And a lot of us, and I suspect especially a lot of us in this room, deal with them by just becoming perfect little A students, perfectionists, overachievers. Right, Mr. CFO, astrophysicist, ultramarathoner? You're all CFO, astrophysicists, ultramarathoners, it turns out. Okay, so fine, right? Except that then we freak out at the possibility that we've gotten something wrong. Because according to this, getting something wrong means there's something wrong with us. So we just insist that we're right, because it makes us feel smart and responsible and virtuous and safe. So let me tell you a story. A couple of years ago, a woman comes into Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center for a surgery. Beth Israel's in Boston. It's the teaching hospital for Harvard, one of the best hospitals in the country. So this woman comes in, and she's taken into the operating room. She's anesthetized. The surgeon does his thing, stitches her back up, sends her out to the recovery room. Everything seems to have gone fine. And she wakes up, and she looks down at herself, and she says, "Why is the wrong side of my body in bandages?" Well, the wrong side of her body is in bandages because the surgeon has performed a major operation on her left leg instead of her right one. When the vice president for healthcare quality at Beth Israel spoke about this incident, he said something very interesting. He said, for whatever reason, the surgeon simply felt that he was on the correct side of the patient. The point of this story is that trusting too much in the feeling of being on the correct side of anything can be very dangerous. This internal sense of rightness that we all experience so often is not a reliable guide to what is actually going on in the external world. And when we act like it is, and we stop entertaining the possibility that we could be wrong, well, you know, that's when we wind up doing things like dumping 200 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, or torpedoing the global economy. So this is a huge practical problem. But it's also a huge social problem. Think for a moment about what it means to feel right. It means that you think that your beliefs just perfectly reflect reality. And when you feel that way, you've got a problem to solve, which is, how are you going to explain all of those people who disagree with you? It turns out most of us explain those people the same way, by resorting to a series of unfortunate assumptions. The first thing we usually do when someone disagrees with us is we just assume they're ignorant. You know, they don't have access to the same information that we do, and when we generously share that information with them, they're going to see the light and come on over to our team. When that doesn't work, when it turns out those people have all the same facts that we do and they still disagree with us, then we move on to a second assumption, which is that they're idiots. They have all the right pieces of the puzzle and they are too moronic to put them together correctly. And when that doesn't work, when it turns out that people who disagree with us have all the same facts we do and are actually pretty smart, then we move on to a third assumption. They know the truth, and they are deliberately distorting it for their own malevolent purposes. So this is a catastrophe. This attachment to our own rightness keeps us from preventing mistakes when we absolutely need to, and causes us to treat each other terribly. But you know, to me, what's most baffling and most tragic about this is that it misses the whole point of being human. You know, it's like we want to imagine that our minds are just these perfectly translucent windows, and we just kind of gaze out of them and describe the world as it unfolds. And we want everybody else to gaze out of the same window and see the exact same thing. That is not true, and if it were, life would be incredibly boring. The miracle of your mind isn't that you can see the world as it is. It's that you can see the world as it isn't. We can remember the past, and we can think about the future, and we can imagine what it's like to be some other person in some other place. And we all do this a little differently, which is why we can all look up at the same night sky and see this, and also this, and also this. And yeah, it is also why we get things wrong. 1,200 years before Descartes said his famous thing about "I think, therefore I am," this guy, St. Augustine, sat down and wrote, "Fallor ergo sum." I err, therefore I am. Augustine understood that our capacity to screw up, it's not some kind of embarrassing defect in the human system, something we can eradicate or overcome. It's totally fundamental to who we are. Because unlike God, we don't really know what's going on out there. And unlike all of the other animals, we are obsessed with trying to figure it out. To me, this obsession is the source and root of all of our productivity and creativity. Last year, for various reasons, I found myself listening to a lot of episodes of the public radio show This American Life. I'm sure a lot of you know it. And so I'm listening, and at some point, I start feeling like all the stories are about being wrong. And my first thought was, I've lost it. I've become the crazy wrongness lady. I just imagine it everywhere, which has happened. But a couple of months later, I actually had a chance to interview Ira Glass, who's the host of the show. And I mentioned this to him, and he was like, no, actually, that's true. In fact, he says, as a staff, we joke that every single episode of our show has the same crypto theme. And the crypto theme is, I thought this one thing was going to happen, and something else happened instead. And the thing is, says Ira Glass, we need this. We need these moments of surprise and reversal and wrongness to make these stories work. And for the rest of us, as audience members, as listeners, as readers, we eat this stuff up. We love things like plot twists and red herrings and surprise endings. When it comes to our stories, we love being wrong. But our stories are like this because our lives are like this. We think this one thing is going to happen, and something else happens instead. George Bush thought he was going to invade Iraq, find a bunch of weapons of mass destruction, liberate the people, and bring democracy to the Middle East. And something else happened instead. And Hosni Mubarak thought he was going to be the dictator of Egypt for the rest of his life until he got too old or too sick and could pass the reins of power on to his son. And something else happened instead. And maybe you thought you were going to grow up and marry your high school sweetheart and move back to your hometown and raise a bunch of kids together. And something else happened instead. And I have to tell you that I thought I was writing an incredibly nerdy book about a subject everybody hates for an audience that would never materialize. And something else happened instead. This is life. For good and for ill, we generate these incredible stories about the world around us. And then the world turns around and astonishes us. No offense, but this entire conference is an unbelievable monument to our capacity to get stuff wrong. We just spent an entire week talking about innovations and advancements and improvements, but you know why we need all of those innovations and advancements and improvements? Because half the stuff that seemed most mind-boggling and world-altering at, TED 1998, didn't really work out that way, did it? You're like, where's my jetpack, Chris? So here we are again. And that's how it goes. We come up with another idea. We tell another story. We hold another conference. The theme of this one, as you guys have now heard 7 million times, is the rediscovery of wonder. And to me, if you really want to rediscover wonder, you need to step outside of that tiny, terrified space of rightness and look around at each other and look out at the vastness and complexity and mystery of the universe and be able to say, wow, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
So there you have it. What'd you think of that? Yeah, it's funny. It's about the fifth or sixth time I've seen it, and it really gets me. I love the analogy when she talks about the Roadrunner. It's like, what does it feel like, to be wrong? Well, it feels like being right. So what we want to do is we're going to take some time to do an exercise, and what I want you to do. My apologies. And what I want you to do, if you can, is maybe pair up. Can we pair up? Nikki, can we maybe pair up too? Can we pair up? And we're going to do 2 rounds, 3 minutes each. We want the first person asks their partner, what happens when you don't know? And then their partner replies, when I don't know, I do this. And we repeat that several times over and over again. You do it over and over again to kind of bring out more and more responses to the surface. Marla does a much better job explaining this than I do. But we'll do 2 rounds. The first round, one of the partners will do this. We'll ask the question and the other will reply. And then after 3 minutes, we'll switch sides. You've done this before. So I'll say, what happens when you don't know? And you,
confused.
what happens when you don't know?
I feel embarrassed.
What happens when you don't know?
I feel dumb.
Right, so you see, the idea is you do this repeatedly several times. It brings more and more things to the surface. And it can be thoughts, emotions, sensations, actions. It can be anything that you like. So I'm going to set the timer. Okay, finish up. Okay, good. Now switch partners. And the other parts, again, this first question, what happens when you don't know? When I don't know, here we go. Okay. So now let's switch back and let's do the second question. What happens when you're wrong? What happens when you're wrong? When I'm wrong,
You're wrong or when you're wrong.
There you go. Ready? And there we go. Okay. Okay, nice work. Congratulate yourself. Does anybody have anything, any ahas, anything that really struck you in your conversation?
Not in the conversation, but I wanted to say something for a while. And that is that I think it's important for all of us to believe that we can all be wrong about things. And that particularly bothers me with politics. When something happened 20 years ago, and that's brought up on whatever side of the political spectrum, and they say, oh, but you, 20 years ago, you said this. It's like, we need to accept that we change our minds, we make mistakes, and so that bothers me even more. I mean, that general, atmosphere of not letting people ever make mistakes or be wrong.
That's a really good point. I think particularly right now that we're kind of moving into political season.
Because then even if you say, I was wrong or I made a mistake, it's like, aha! And we shouldn't have that aha part, in my opinion.
Yeah, anybody? I think that's a really good point. I mean, it should be, in my mind, it ought to be a sign of growth to say, yeah, I used to think X, but I've thought about it more. I've listened, I've searched it out, and now I think that I was wrong about that. Wouldn't it be great if we had political leaders that were comfortable doing that? That's a really good insight.
Examples, wouldn't they? If they did that. So the way I see this discussion about things when there's a turnaround with understanding your wrongness, and it's amazing the switch when you're finally admitting that wrongness, and you're going through the whole gambit of emotions and thoughts and sensations, and when you finally just own that wrongness, it's a relief. And just in our discussions, Jeffrey and mine, I was like, oh, you finally take control of that wrongness, and then you feel so much better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's very liberating.
Yeah, it is.
Aha!
Yeah,
Can I share a brief story?
totally.
So many years ago, I was a school teacher, and I taught gifted and talented children down in California. I went to a conference, California Association for the Gifted Conference, and there were a bunch of speakers there. One of the guys was a teacher of the year, had a waiting list to get into his class. He taught 4th grade. The first week of the class, all the kids did, and it was a hard first week, was they started making lists of things they didn't know. It was all they did.
Wow.
And he would teach them to start figuring out what they don't know. And
Yeah.
at first it was really hard.
Yeah.
And their list was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And they'd struggle with it. But after a while, their list got more detailed and more
Yeah.
robust. And they literally wrote them on stuff and covered all the walls. Once they got comfortable with saying, I don't know, the rest of the year, they were insatiably curious. And they wanted to know. And his level of work dropped because all they wanted to do was get out of my way. I want to research this thing and find out.
Isn't that great?
So we got them very comfortable with
Yeah.
their ignorance and very curious.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this is about that as well. If you hold on to your knowledge, it's mine, then it's hard to let go. But if you hold on to your ignorance,
Yeah.
I have this ignorance. and
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna work with my ignorance. Wow, it's gonna be great. I'm gonna ask a bunch of questions.
Yeah. Great story. Yeah. I think that is so true. I mean, I find, like I said, for me, I mean, I started several years ago, looking at some of the science behind emotions. And I read one little book. I thought, yeah, I've got a stack like this big now. The more you read about something, I think the more you realize how much there is to know about it, and it's humbling. I think in a good way. And that's an exciting story. Don't you wish every child in America had that kind of a school experience?
Just a few adults in it.
Well, yeah, that's right. That's true. Anybody else before we go to a break? Well, good. I hope, again, I hope you enjoyed Catherine Schultz. I think she's a great entry point, just the whole idea of being a wrongologist. I think it's a great way, and again, it's a great way, we think, to ground the idea of critical thinking. So we're open and we're in this kind of exploratory mode. So let's take maybe about 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back, and I'm going to tell you, you've heard people say that humans learn by stories. Well, I'm going to tell you the story of your mind a little bit in the next time. We're going to look at least what some scientists, social scientists, think is at back of why it is that we have to be right? Is there something in our evolutionary development that has kind of geared us this way? Well, I'm going to go through about 20 minutes to kind of share with you some of the new science on that, which I think is kind of interesting. So about 10 minutes. And next week, Marla will be back. She's the master of the exercises. We've kind of looked at being right from a personal perspective. And what I want to do now is, as I think you know by now, I'm really into evolutionary psychology and trying to understand how the story of how humans evolved. And so we're going to open that up a little bit. It shouldn't take that long, but I want to give you what is one of the most important insights from the social sciences that's really come online only in the last decade. And it's the fruit of a lot of research that's been examining why we disagree about facts, why we have people that deny things like global warming or what have you. And again, it crosses party lines. Why is that? So what I'm going to present is really I think it's very, very interesting. It's well documented, and it's really useful in understanding the fact that reasoning, our ability to reason as humans, is about being right. For a long time, if you come from the Christian tradition, the idea that humans reason, it's because we're made in the image of God. And God is a rational being. And made in the image of God, we therefore are rational beings like God is. But as we've been opening up a little bit here and there, turns out the social science is showing that actually we're not very rational. Actually, we are led more by our emotions and our intuitive minds. We talked about the idea that we're feeling machines that think, which is the reverse of what everyone from the Greeks to Christians to the scholastics of the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries believed. The big insight, reasoning is about being right. That is, we construct the world in our defense. We have what they call my side bias. Another way of talking about it that's a little more popular in some circles is to say we are motivated reasoners. That is, we have an inner press agent. We believe almost anything that serves our team. And this is one of the major insights from a book that came out in 2012 from Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. This book, John Haidt, whose work is foundational to what Marla and I do in our bridging talks. If you come to our bridging talks, we get into his stuff quite a bit. This was something that Haidt presented in a very popular form. And just recently, the underlying research has come out in a way that really makes a powerful case that we are motivated reasoners. And again, bear in mind, minds evolved by natural selection, as we noted in our introductory class. And this is the most basic fact of life. We have adapted minds. Our minds didn't come down from heaven as some kind of system like a computer with all kinds of neatly arranged parts to do all these kind of stuff. Our minds evolved. They are adapted. And this is an insight from John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, who are the founders of a relatively recent discipline called evolutionary psychology, where they note that the brain is a physical system. It functions like a computer to process information. Different neural circuits are specialized for solving different adaptive problems. Our minds didn't evolve to do poetry and math and science. Our minds evolved to be able to deal with solving problems in the environment. We're going to open that up a little bit today. They say our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind. Who's heard the term Stone Age minds before? Well, it's one of my most popular little memes that I present. Well, the idea is the formative period of human brain development was the Stone Age. We looked a little bit in our first class about why we have minds, how minds evolved. Minds evolved over millions of years. They evolved to adapt and survive in the environment. Our ability to think evolved to help us survive in the environment. And the most critical period when that was happening is what we roughly call the Stone Age, when humans were hunter-gatherers, foraging and hunting on the plains of Africa. And what I want you to do is I want you to close your eyes for a second. And I want you to imagine for a minute what it would be like to go on an extended camping trip. Let's say you're going to go out to the plains of the desert in eastern Oregon with all of your family, all of your friends, all of the people you work with, all the people who are in your social environment, everyone that you are with on a regular basis. You were to go out, let's say you take a year and go out to eastern Oregon on a camping trip. What would that be like? What kinds of problems would you have to deal with? Well, you can open your eyes. You get an idea what it's like? Well, according to evolutionary psychologists, living in the Stone Age was like a camping trip that lasted an entire lifetime. This was the norm for millions of years. This is how people lived for millions of years. This was the time when our brains were developing. This is when we were getting all that ability to think, that deliberative system was developing that we looked at last period. And again, this is during what's called the Paleolithic Age, which is roughly about 2.6 million years ago, up until the dawn of agriculture, which I put 10,000 BCE there, but they keep pushing it back, so it may have actually been not quite as long as that. But again, this is the critical time for brain development. What was going on that made our brains develop the ability to think and especially to reason? And it's important to note that Stone Age people were cooperators. Our brains evolved in a context where humans were learning how to cooperate in teams together. Humans developed the ability, for example, to hunt big game. It was the hunting of big game and the eating of meat that gave us the protein to expand our minds and all that kind of thing. But humans developed an amazing ability to cooperate in ways that other primates didn't. You don't see that level of cooperation. And the kind of cooperation that you need to have when you're out on a camping trip. If you've been camping, you know it's really hard to get everybody doing the right thing when you're out in that kind of an environment. Again, living in the Stone Age when our minds were developing was like being on an extended camping trip that lasted an entire lifetime. And one of the biggest things you have to deal with is learning how to get along with people. Our brains didn't develop to do science. Our brains developed to be able to get along with people. This is what evolutionary psychologists believe. This is the key to understanding why it is we have to be right all the time. Because in that kind of an environment, you have to learn how to deliberate. We saw last time the difference between System 1 thinking, which is our fast kind of intuitive thinking, and System 2 thinking, which is our slow thinking. Our slow thinking is something that developed later. It's something that really is rooted in the neocortex, the new cortex that surrounds our brain. And the key idea is that reasoning, our ability to reason, to think, is an evolutionary adaptation to help us cooperate and solve problems in our social world. And this is a really important insight, a great book that they have over there. I love this book, Thinking Big, How the Evolution of Social Life Shaped the Human mind. We are social creatures more than anything else. And it's our socialization, our need to get along with one another that drove the development of our brains to the point where today we have the ability to do all the science and the art and all that we do. But it didn't start there. It started with really basic getting along in the social environment. Again, human intelligence evolved as a means of surviving and reproducing in large and complex social groups. This is why human thinking is the way that it is. It's like Survivor. You've seen the show Survivor, right? When you put them on, you haven't seen the show Survivor? Maybe you're not missing anything. But the whole idea behind the Survivor show, you get a bunch of people together and you put a camera on them and you watch them. And what do? You watch how they learn to manipulate one another. And what's key in Survivor or any kind of social environment is the need to manage your reputation. People monitor their own actions and thinking based on the perspectives and evaluations of others in their social group. Think if you've seen Survivor, when it's always about who's doing what, how am I going to keep my allegiance, and what have you. There's all this kind of this stuff that's going on to kind of manage your reputation and what have you.
Cooperation and competition.
That's right. Exactly. It's finding that balance, because in order to cooperate, you have to be able to compete, and vice versa. Yeah, that's a really good point. And again, managing our reputation is what's critical. It's really important. If you've watched Survivor, you see these kinds of things. Making sure that everybody has the right idea. It's like camping. You want to make sure that everybody knows that you're doing your part, that you're doing your job. You don't want the rumor to be, think about if you're back in the Stone Age, not doing your part might mean you getting thrown out of the tribe. You might not be able to survive if you're thrown out of the tribe. If someone thinks that you're not pulling your weight, that you're not cooperating and playing your role. So managing your reputation is key to how we think and how our minds evolved. And this is a key idea. Holding people accountable is essential for cooperation. If you have a cooperative endeavor, you have to be able to hold people accountable in that environment if it's going to work. The expectation that you will be called upon to justify your beliefs, feelings, or actions to others. Again, think about survival. You have to be able to justify what you're doing before the group. You have to be able to make an argument, to maintain your reputation in the group. The expectation that people will reward or punish us based on how well we justify ourselves. And the social scientists are saying this is the root of how humans learn to think. Wasn't doing art. We learn to think by managing our reputation, justifying our position in the social hierarchy in small groups over really hundreds of thousands of years as humans became more cognitively able. And this is why they say reasoning is fundamentally about being right. We're not naturally critical thinkers. We're naturally motivated thinkers. We construct the world in our defense, what's called my side bias. And what's important to note is that this is a feature, not a bug. This is a feature of our human operating system, which is why it comes so naturally to us. Which is why we have to work at the fact that we have this sense that we have to be right. And that we're motivated to prove our point, our position, that we're doing the right thing. It's hard for us to admit we're wrong. We have to really kind of engage in that generally. And this is an insight from, I was going to try and find the book. Like I said, about 20 years really of research on this from Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, who are two French evolutionary psychologists, in their book, The Enigma of Reason, which is really a groundbreaking kind of book. And after I did this talk earlier this year, talked about this, and I found this wonderful article in The Economist. I don't know if anybody reads The Economist, but a really great British news magazine that's been around forever. And this article is called The Partisan Brain, getting to the issue of politics. What psychology experiments tell you about why people deny facts. And again, this research is all coming out because of this problem we have with people who deny certain facts about the world. And the writer of The Economist confirms what I've been talking about from the social sciences, that reasoning evolved to improve the ability of ancestral hunter-gatherer groups to cooperate in small groups. And then they quote the authors by saying, what reason does is help us justify our beliefs and actions to others and evaluate the justifications and arguments that others address to us. We have this kind of my side bias, individually, but also in terms of groups, because we evolved in small groups that tended to compete with other groups. We have this kind of team orientation built into our minds, which is why we're quick to defend our team. Whether we're watching a baseball game and the ump makes a bad call, right? We always want to defend, we want to defend our side. Or particularly you see it with politics. You can talk to your blue in the face with somebody who's on one side of the political divide, and it's like they're not even hearing the facts. They're not, because they have a pre-commitment. They are motivated to believe what's going to serve their team. This is an evolutionary adaptation that drives our thinking. It's something that we have to manually overcome. Again, the way that Jonathan Haidt puts it is that we have an inner press agent. Think of Sarah Sanders. You know, she has to have, or Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She has to have the worst job in the country. I can't imagine a worse job than being the press agent for our president. No matter how you feel about our president, he's a very difficult person to defend much of the time. And but this is kind of what we channel naturally, the ability, we want to defend what we do, defend our actions all the time for our own survival, which is why we have to be right all the time. But this is not just something that the social scientists have, discovered. I mean, this is a quote from Ben Franklin going back to the time of the founding of our country. Franklin said, "So convenient a thing to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do." We are motivated reasoners, and even before the social scientists came along, people intuitively know, there's just something about human nature. We have to be right. We have to defend our positions. So as a critical thinker, we have to be aware of this kind of basic bias we have and not be afraid to be wrong. We're not going to get tossed out of the tribe. We're not going to be left out in the desert without food and without provisions for being wrong. And yet that kind of thing animates much of our thinking due to our evolutionary psychology. This idea of motivated reason, it's the difference between exploratory thinking and confirmatory thinking. This is motivated reasoning, confirmatory thinking. A one-sided attempt to rationalize a particular point of view. Confirmatory thinking. You get into a discussion with a friend about an issue, and the friend says, "You're wrong about that. What do? The natural tendency is to go home, maybe you get on Google and do what? See if you're wrong or see if you're right. Exactly. It's a natural tendency, and much of it has to do, again, with how our minds evolved. We tend to be motivated reasoners. We tend to need to be right. It feeds what's called confirmation bias. You've heard of confirmation bias. We're going to look at confirmation bias next week. And what's critical is that this is rooted in our neurobiology. It's an instinct-driven process. It's not something that we learn, although society reinforces it in lots of really bad ways. It's something that's quite natural to us. What we need to do is something that isn't natural to us. That is, we need to be exploratory thinkers. Exploratory thinking is an even-handed consideration of different points of view, not having to be right. You just want to know what's true. You don't have a dog in the fight. You don't have a horse in the race. This is critical reasoning, which is related to critical thinking. I need to know the truth. Non-motivated reasoning. I'm not motivated to be right. I'm not motivated to prove something. I just want to know what's true. This is a discovery process. You have to be an anthropologist from Mars. You have to go on a discovery, not a defensive kind of maneuver. But it's a manual process. We have to engage in this process. And importantly, we'll get into this in our last class, this is what science does. Science is an exploratory endeavor. Science is about disproving your theory. I love to tell people Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, but he came up with the idea about 30 years earlier than that. Well, what was he doing during that 30 years? Well, one of the things he was doing was trying to disprove his theory. That's what science does, skepticism. Because he knew if he couldn't disprove his theory, it might be right. So you have to go in with that with that idea of falsification the scientists talk about. So again, exploratory thinking versus confirmatory thinking. And of course, critical thinking is the former. It's this exploratory kind of thinking. It's objective analysis and evaluation. You have to be skeptical. You have to ask questions. You're not looking to just prove what your assumptions really are. You have to question the assumptions of others, but also your own. And as I was preparing this, this is one of my favorite little quotes. I could have just put this slide up at the very beginning and said, this is really this is a wonderful little Zen saying. If you want the truth to stand clear before you, never be for or against. The struggle between for and against is the mind's worst disease. It's the idea of, again, we're talking about critical thinking. We're not talking necessarily about taking a moral stand or what have you. But if you're trying to think about the world, you're trying to gain knowledge, never be for or against. Just really try and have some clarity about what's before you and objectively analysis without having a dog in the fight. So this kind of epitomizes this idea of how we have to get beyond this problem of my side bias. So I wanted to share that a little bit with you because I think part of the class too is to kind of give you a sense of where we've come from and how our minds have evolved. And this is one of the key reasons why we need to be right. So that's what I had to say. Questions, comments, discussion, the floor is open. Oh, Aries, can you hold 1 second?
Hopefully the background's not too bad. Well, I got a couple things, I guess. One, and then I can kind of mute myself and let you guys discuss. But one thing is, I guess I'm trying to think of if right and wrong are sort of opposites, and being inquisitive is somewhere in the middle. The other thing that seems to lie in the middle is sort of this non-conviction, and I guess, or not taking a side. I think Dante said something the deepest layers of hell or whatever are reserved for people who stay neutral in times of conflict. So how do you stop yourself from just maybe I think all, especially probably a room full of liberals can sit here and say there's plenty of people they know who they just kind of sit there and they think, well, we just don't know enough. We just don't have enough information to make a call on this. So I'm just going to sit this one out. And what is the risk in that? And then my second thought that I wanted to bring up was where like normative values come into these discussions, because it's easy to say like we should all seek out objective truth, but at some point we have to bring values
Yes.
into our determination of what is right and wrong. And I think like I have a good friend who is a big Star Trek fan, and we've had a lot of discussions about Vulcans. And one day, you know, she reveres Vulcans for their logical objectivity. But one day we came to this realization that like when they make these logic-based decisions, there's still this base of moral values that they have to incorporate into their decisions, right? They have to have this feeling of, is it better to let a captain die or to let 100 crew members die? And when they make these in the instant decisions that seem so logical, there's still an underlying moral value that underpins them. So those are my two questions, and I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on them.
Well, let me read back, and then we'll open it up and let people, because I'm sure people want to weigh in. Because I wanted to be careful to note that in using this particular quote, what I was really talking about is thinking and how we analyze the situation. Because you're absolutely right. Thinking alone is not going to necessarily tell us what to do about a problem. It may help us to define what the problem is in fact. But when it comes to what to do about it, those are, as you noted, moral questions. That's where we have to get into morality, which is something that we talk about in other places. But the idea that we're trying to present in terms of critical thinking is before you make a decision to do something, which is a moral thing, which really relies upon other parts of the brain to a large degree, we have to get clear about what the facts of a situation are. And to me, that's the role of critical thinking, is how do we ascertain what's true so that we can apply our moral values to act.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. Thanks. I mean, I guess if you, in the politics discussion, had two very reasonable people who sat down and agreed on all the facts and objective truths, and one of them said, in that case, we should reduce government regulation, and the other one said, in that case, we should increase government regulation. You're okay with that standstill? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the next step that you go to. But before you can do that, for example, let's take climate change, which is or something like GMOs, which is a different kind of separation. You have to be able to agree on what the facts are, I would say, first. And that's a process more of critical reasoning, deliberation. We'll talk about this in our last class a little bit more about how exactly science works. But once you get those facts, then we have to have debate and discussion about how we apply that knowledge to act. So let's see if more people want to weigh in on this or anything else. Are you good with that, or you want to?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
But I think it's a really good point, and it's funny because when I put this on the board, I added this slide this time around because I thought this was a really great quote. I love this quote. But you're right. It doesn't tell you, it's not necessarily saying we have to remain neutral about moral things, right? Because we can't live that way. We can't survive that way. We have to be able to make decisions about what to do ultimately. Let's hear for some more people, though. Anybody? Doesn't have to be about this. It can be about anything. If you got a question or a comment that you want to weigh in on. Yeah.
So at dinner the other evening, a fellow brought up a quote from some prominent politician in the past, something to the effect of, you have the right to your own opinion, but not to your own facts.
Moynihan.
But we seem to be in a time when we can't agree upon the facts. That there's too much bias towards my side.
Well, yeah, and again, and that's why for us, you could start a critical thinking course looking at, how to make a logical argument and how do you do, and those are important things, but we sort of feel like it's this kind of stuff you have to lay out first before you do that, because you're right. The reason why people, and again, this is what the science has been getting to as we've been looking at this problem recently, is that it really has a lot to do with what we bring into the world, our operating systems, why it is why we can't agree on facts. Because there's something that is more logically prior to the facts, and that's our own perception of the world and what we bring to it. These biases and what have you.
I don't know if I can express this, but in answer or in response, what's his name?
Ari.
About two sides maybe agreeing on the facts, maybe saying in a government situation, for example, taxes. Taxes provide schools, taxes provide parks for us to go to, etc. And so one side will say, yes, those taxes do provide that, but I want to have my own individual feeling and opinion about that, or my feeling that I don't need that, but it's there for everyone. It's the common good, is what the other side would say. So both sides are agreeing that taxes provide this, but then they split on how they think should one be more government regulated or one not.
Right.
And so then
that's a big one.
They're split. So then how does one, they both see the facts that taxes provide. I'm just trying to pull this out from maybe what he was saying there. They both see they might agree on the fact, but then they split. And so that's where we are divided now in our politics.
That's right. And when we do our talk in Bend that we're going to do on how to get beyond left and right, the centerpiece of that talk is what are the different moral values that people have on the left and the right, because they're different. It's a critical one, and if you're on one side or the other, appreciating where the other is coming from will help you have a dialogue and understand. So, it's absolutely, Ari's really made a good point. Ari's made a great point, is that, again, critical thinking is just the entry point. We do this year-long class. The first third is critical thinking. The second third is what we call moral tribes. How do we apply what's happening inside us in terms of morality then where we take the facts and actually begin to think about what do we do? Because decision making is rooted deeply in our limbic system, in our older brains. So we have to pay attention to all of it.
Not give you success with the competition. So I just don't understand where it comes from.
Well, I would say competition is what gives you success. I would say that competition is the strength of the market. Not that the market doesn't have weaknesses too, but it's the competing that we have, the competing for status, the competing to outdo one another that tends to drive innovation, tends to drive, it is something, that's a whole nother conversation to have.
Yeah, but
yeah.
I see the pros and cons, yes, absolutely, but I see more cons because it creates divisiveness. It definitely creates a have and have not, all of these not so good things that we're seeing pop up a lot more in what's happening in the world.
Yeah.
Due to competition, and I actually blame sometimes capitalism as part of that too.
Well, all capitalism does is it provides a way for people in a free market to be able to pool resources to create products and do whatever. What you can be. You could be an angel and do really well at capitalism, or you can be a devil, and do really well at capitalism. And the thing that because we did a whole thing, we did a whole talk on the problems with capitalism, but also the benefits of capitalism. Because capitalism is why we're on the verge of eliminating worldwide poverty. I mean, Africa is booming because of the market. There are always downsides to the market because the market is us, it's people. And you're right, the competitive instinct has to be has to be regulated. It has to be monitored. It has to be. You have to be able to protect the society from being overrun. The chimps do it by ganging up on the alpha chimps and just taking them out. We have, we do that as well in a certain way. Instinctively we kind of do that. But, in the marketplace, balancing cooperation with competitiveness. My dad watches tennis. And when you watch these players, it's the competitiveness that brings out the skill, to outdo the other. That can be healthy, but it can also be kind of a pathology, if it gets out of whack. But it's the competitiveness between people that makes for better athletes, that makes for better products. It's the fact that if I'm making a widget and I know the guy across town is making a widget, I want to make a better widget. That can be a very good, wholesome thing if it's balanced with some of these other concerns, I would say. But both of them are kind of rooted in our human nature.
It's part of human nature.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying, there are problems with capitalism, but when you look at capitalism compared to, say, socialism, socialism did a lot of damage, has done a lot of damage in the world. Well, we're seeing that right now in Venezuela. Well-meaning, but it's very difficult to organize a society from the top down, which is what socialism tends to do. The market tends to do it from the bottom up, but that gives people freedom to do some really nasty things. And it's like, how do you manage all that? Oh.
You're saying that you grew up in a capitalist nation, and in your entire life you've lived and breathed capitalism. If you had grown up in Venezuela, you might have a totally different worldview.
Well, I don't think you would today.
But you might have 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think most people, again, you just have to look at where people move to. You ask yourself the question, would you rather be in South Korea or North Korea? Would you rather have been in East... Well, when we were growing up, would you rather be in East Germany or West Germany? Again, it's not to say that there aren't problems with the market. But, the thing I always remind people, too, is that the market, as it was originally envisioned, you read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. Before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote the moral sentiments. You have to have a moral basis in a market to be successful. And I would argue, my opinion, that's really the problem today, is we've got a lot of people in the market who lack the moral intuitions to do good. The idea of a corporation originally had a lot to do with people coming together to do benefit for the society. So you can have a corporation that does that. They have B Corps now that do that. So we can do things to make the market more cooperative, more friendly, more balanced, more competitive in the best sense of the word. That's what I think we ought to be doing.
It's bringing back moral and ethics back into capitalism.
Totally. And there's quite a movement today to do that, of people who, particularly younger people, who are saying, listen, we like the market, we want the freedom, we want to be innovative, we want to be entrepreneurs, but we need to have a higher value than just making money. That's a moral choice.
Can you go back a couple slides? Keep going. There we go. I'm thinking about, this one here. Thinking about what you're talking about in the problems in politics today. And it occurs to me that the moral value today in politics is to be right and to sabotage what the other party is trying to accomplish. And we can talk about where this came from, but that's all interesting aside. I think what would be a rational next step for us as a nation would be to say, we agree that we have different opinions about how to get there, but we agree that there are certain things we all want, and let's come to agree on what we all want. Okay, we've agreed these are the core values we have. We differ in how we think we're going to get there, but right now your party has been voted in, so you're holding the torch. So we agree that we're going to cooperate and not sabotage, but we get to still put our input in as long as you're in charge. And when the vote switches and it's our turn, you agree to not sabotage, and we're going to use science, you've got a theory, we're going to test your theory. Then we're going to see how well your theory works. And since you're in charge, you have to agree that we're all going to collect data that we all agree upon, and we're going to evaluate the data. And we could be wrong, but so could you. And we'll evaluate the data, and after 2 years, if the data works, we'll keep doing it. If it doesn't, we'll stop. In the same way that doctors do case studies, and after a couple of years, they say, this medicine looks good, or they say, we're going to stop the case study right now because people are dying and it's really obvious, whatever. It seems like that's the key. We need to let go of this being right and let go of sabotaging and get to a place where we say, we agree on this idea. We don't agree on how to get there, but you got voted in, we're going to give you the chance to go ahead, but we get to provide a little bit of steering, and we get to collect data collectively.
What you just said is really what Marla and I are trying to do with our bridging work, is exactly that. Is we use this word consilience. We have to bring facts from different sides together. Don't reject the facts that other people have. We're not right about everything, but exactly what you described as deliberative democracy. I think that's the kind of government that we have. We're just not doing it that way. And it's the partisanship on both sides. That drives it. I would say different times we get it different ways. Right now, you've got a Republican in the White House, and the Democrats are kind of going crazy. But I always remind people, remember about a decade ago, we had the summer of Obamacare, and the Republicans were going crazy. Both sides, get into this moral outrage when we really need to do exactly what you just said. I think right now, I was going to say countries like Britain, but Britain has a terrible problem right now. We actually, I think, we have a different government than the European social democracies. I actually think we do it pretty well. Considering, let me rephrase that. In principle, I think we have the structure is there to do it well. But we're really ginned up with this being right and this partisanship right now. But I think the structure of our government, because I grew up at a time when it was more like that, where there was more cooperation, so we can do it. And the question is, why have we become so partisan? And how can we reverse that trend, I would say?
Getting the values and the morals back in, I think. Everybody's, seems like it's all focused on money and power. And basically for your own personal interests.
Yeah, it's sad. And I don't think it was like that. And I don't think I'm just being nostalgic. I think there's a lot of data that suggests that this is something that's been getting worse and worse and worse over the years. And yeah, certainly there's so much money everywhere. I was talking about tennis. There's a tennis championship in Madrid right now. And the winner's going to make $1 million. Right? And, there's so much money out there. It isn't just politics. There's money everywhere. And money does have can have a really corrupting influence. And it certainly seems to be having that, on our politics. But we're hopeful that we can persuade people that there are more people around the country that feel this way. I think most people kind of feel this way, that if we kind of banded together a little bit more and pushed all the extremists, kind of out of the story, that we'd have a much better result.
I think it worked a whole lot better when everyone in politics looked like me. All white men. As soon as we started allowing women, people of color in, by golly, different opinions, it was so difficult.
Well, one thing that did really change it, and not to get partisan, but I think it is true that even though the Democrats were really nasty to the Republicans in the House for a long time, and the result of that was that Newt Gingrich, they had the Republican Revolution, and Newt Gingrich came in there like a bulldog and said, I'm going to be a mean SOB, and he destroyed the culture, the good culture of Washington by telling people, don't live in Washington, don't become friends, don't. It used to be that the congressional wives.
After
So the collegiality is lost, and a lot of people, I think, lay that at the feet of Newt Gingrich, and certainly the Republicans in the '90s did a lot of really damage. And on the contrary, you have to ask yourself the question: what has the resistance done in the last couple of years? Has that been a good course of action? How should we move forward? Is the resistance that we're seeing from the left, is that helping? Or is it making things even worse? You have to ask yourself who's going to stop it? Who's going to stand up and say enough? Let's come together and really try and be bipartisan. Somebody has to do that. I'm not hearing any of the candidates out there. Certainly our president is not of that mind. And I don't think that's a partisan statement. But, I'm waiting for a candidate to be a bridger, to say, listen, I'm willing to sit down and really forge, some bipartisanship, and we have seen it. We just had a prison reform, the criminal justice reform bill, which was bipartisan, which was really great. There's a group in the Congress called No Label. There's a group called No Labels that works within the Congress trying to bring bipartisan support. There's a lot of effort to get immigration solved. There's a bipartisan consensus to solve our immigration problem, and yet the politics is preventing people from really coming together. Again, you got to be right. I got to be right about my side of the story.
I think it goes back to Marla's point about the three assumptions. The assumption of ignorance. I wrote these down because I thought, yes.
I wish she was here.
The assumption of ignorance, the assumption of idiocy, and the assumption of evil on both sides. And you hear our president tweeting the evil media, whatever.
It's awful.
And then you hear the other side, he is an idiot. I've heard the words,
Yep.
all of these words, idiocy, he's evil.
Contempt.
He's ignorant.
Yep.
He's, all of that. And vice versa.
Yep.
On both sides. And so when you're that way, when those words are being used on both sides, then how do we come together? And then splitting families and friends.
Oh, totally.
I have friends and families on both sides, of course, we all do. But I have friends who won't speak to their relatives.
Yeah.
And that's really hard because I have a sister who's very different than I am, and I have another sister who's to the left of where I am.
Yeah.
One to the right of where I am. And so, but I can't say to my sister who's very much more to the right of where I would be that I can't ever speak to her because I love her dearly.
Yeah.
She's the kindest heart I've ever met.
Yeah.
And so you think, you have to look at those human values within people. That beyond, that's evil because you support this.
Yeah.
That you're therefore evil. That
Yeah.
you are therefore an ignorant or an idiot. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah. Well, it's 9:04. Unless anybody has something they really, really want to say, feel free to go. Thanks. I'm sorry Marla wasn't here tonight. I'm sure she missed the discussion. She'll be back next week. And I'm telling you, she's doing double time next week. I'm going to sit. No. But